Hi, I just finished quilting this beautiful macaw quilt, and now it's time to bind it. And I'm thinking that I don't want to see a binding around this beautiful printed edge that I have. So I'm going to face it instead of binding it, and I'll show you how I'm going to do that. You still have to make your binding just like you would make your binding for a regular quilt. You cut your strips, you sew them all together, fold them with the wrong sides together, and press them. I chose to do a wider strip instead of the 2.5-inch strip folded in half because I want a wider facing on the back of my quilt. So I cut 4.5-inch strips, and then I sewed them all together with just a straight seam, and then I folded them in half and I ironed them. So now we're going to square off our quilt, cut all the excess away right to the edge of the quilt, and then we're going to put the binding on. There it is, all squared off. So the next step is to take your binding and attach it with a 1/4-inch seam to the quilt. So I have my raw edges of my binding, even with the raw edges of the quilt, and I'm going to start in the middle of a side, and I'm going to leave quite a bit of a tail, and I'm just going to sew this a 1/4 inch all the way around. Now it's important when I get to the corner to pivot properly, because all of this binding is going to be folded to the back side of the quilt. There will be none of it showing on the front, and I want to be able to get a good point in the corner. So I'm going to put it on like I put a regular binding on, and I'm sorry, I'm using black on black, but that's what I wanted on this quilt, so it's going to be a little tough to see. But I take my raw edges and I line them up with the raw edges of my quilt. And when I get to a corner, I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch from the edge of the quilt, and I'm going to stop a 1/4 inch before I get to the end of the seam, the end of the quilt. So I'm going to stop a 1/4 inch in from both edges. I'm going to needle down, and then at that point when my needle's in place, I'm going to snip just the binding at a diagonal. I'm going to just take my scissors and snip the binding at a diagonal to right where my needle is. And then the binding will open up nicely in order to turn and continue down the other edge of the quilt. Once I've got that done, I'm going to want to snip straight across that corner without snipping the threads at all, so that I'll be able to turn that, then turn my binding to the opposite side of the quilt. So let me show you what that looks like. Okay, so I'm coming close to the corner of my quilt, and I've drawn a white mark where my stitching line is, which is a 1/4 inch from both edges. And then I snipped right to the corner, and so that you can see it, I got a piece of paper here. I'm going to show you. There's the corner of my quilt, and there's my facing or binding, and then where my snip is, when I turn this, it's going to open up for me and let me turn the corner nicely. So I'm going to needle down in that corner, and then I'm going to pivot. So here I go. I'm going to bring the stitch length down to 2.0. And one more stitch. So I'm needled down right in the corner, and I'm going to lift up my foot with the needle down, and I'm going to keep all of this facing out of the way, and I'm going to turn my corner, and because I was 1/4 of an inch away, it turns and it meets up nicely with the edge of my quilt. So now, with all this facing out of the way, put my foot back down, and no bad tacking or anything, I can just keep going. And I'm going to bring my stitch length back up to a 2.5, and I'm going to continue all the way around the quilt, and I'm going to do that at every corner. So here's another way to turn that corner, making sure that you're 1/4 of an inch from both edges. When you're sewing along here, it's hard to tell where the end of the quilt is, but you can do it with a piece of paper. I can match up my edge, and I can see that my edge is here underneath, and I can match up that piece of paper on there. And then when I'm stitching along, I can look at the line on my foot. If you have a marked 1/4 inch foot that has these lines before and after the foot, there's one after the needle over here, that's a 1/4 inch on the back edge of the quilt. That's where my needle is, where that line is, and then where the line in the front is the 1/4 inch ahead of my foot. So if I'm stitching along, once my needle is in and that line is matched up with my piece of paper, like that, I know I'm 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the quilt. And I have to do my snip, diagonal snip, and then turn my corner. Now you can either snip right before you put your needle down, or you can snip while the needle's down. It's easier to do it before you needle down, but you've got to know exactly where that corner is going to be before you snip. So now the facing is all put on the quilt, and it's ready to turn over to the back. But before I do that, I'm going to want a sleeve on this quilt. So I made my sleeve the way I normally would. It's a 5-inch sleeve. I folded over 1/4 of an inch and pressed it so that I can stitch it to the hand stitch it to the back of the quilt. However, when I put it on to the facing, I don't want it right up on the edge of the quilt where the facing is attached. I want it to be in the facing by about 1 inch. So I'm marking a spot on my facing. I know it's black on black and you can't really see it, but I'm lining up my 1-inch line with the seam line that I just made by putting the facing on, and now I'm just giving it a mark with my white pen. Once that dries, you can see it. And then when I go to put my facing on, it's going to be put on with the right sides together, so your 1/4 inch is facing up, and it's not the side we stitch. We stitch the raw edge side, and you're going to line it up along that line you just marked, and you're going to stitch 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the sleeve. And then when I roll the whole thing over to the back, I'll be able to make a D sleeve out of it. So let me put that on and then I'll show you what it looks like. Alright, so I've attached my sleeve to my facing with the raw edge of the sleeve pointed towards the fold. So now when you look at the right side of the quilt, I'm about 1 inch in from my seam line on the facing. And the facing ends up folding right on that seam line, so that we have a nice clean edge where you don't see any binding and you don't see any seam line. It's just a beautiful clean edge on that printed border. On the back, now that we have the sleeve on here, you can see that the sleeve is down a little bit from the edge of the quilt, and I did that on purpose because it's supposed to be a D sleeve. And a D sleeve gives you room for the rod inside without making the quilt curl. So when I stitch this folded edge to the back of the quilt, I'm not going to flatten it out to stitch it. I'm going to bring it up to match the edge, the top edge of the quilt, and then I'm going to pin it to the back of my quilt and stitch it down. And then that way I end up with room in there for a nice wide rod, and it's not going to make my quilt curl. But before I stitch down that sleeve, I've got to actually stitch down the facing inside. So I'm going to keep this folded up, and I'm going to make sure that I'm folded all along the edge on that seam line so that you don't see any seam on the front. And to do that, I'm just going to pin it to hold it securely in place, because it's with that extra sleeve on there, it's hard to see what you're doing. So I'm going to just pin it along the whole thing like that, and then I know that it's going to be nice and flat, and I can hand stitch that down, and then I can turn my facing down, and I can hand stitch the facing down as well. It seems like extra work, but I really wanted the sleeve on here. So let me show you now how to do the corners. So here, we'll go to a corner that isn't done, just a regular corner. If you don't want a sleeve on your quilt, then this is what you're going to do. You're going to have to snip that corner diagonally off, and you don't want to snip through the stitching, so you got to look very carefully at your stitching. So there's my corner. I happen to be using black thread, so it's hard to see. My scissors are black too. I'm batting 1,000 here. So here's my thread. I'm going to mark it with this white pen. Okay, so there's my corner. I used black thread, but I tried to mark it with white on here so you could see where my stitching is. And we don't want to snip through the stitching at all. We just want to snip that diagonal corner off. So I'm going to make sure I have the layers and not the sashing, just the corner. And I'm going to snip that corner off. I want to make sure I get all the extra off, because I don't want anything in there to make it bulky. And you got to be very careful not to snip the threads. And then when you're turning your corner to the right side, you're going to poke that right in there. And you end up with a beautiful corner, a beautiful clean corner. So here we are down on the table, and I've turned my corner. I've already snipped my corner, and I've poked it right in there. And I'm going to turn down my side so that my seam line is right on the edge of the quilt. And I'm going to make sure this is going all the way to the end, and then this is going to be my miter here, so I'm going to just finger press that a little bit. And when I flip it over so that the seam line is on the edge this way, I can tuck all that in there, and I end up with a perfect miter on the corner on the back side of the quilt. So that ends up being a perfect miter. So that can be hand stitched shut, and then the facing can be hand stitched to the back of the quilt. And then when you're looking at the front, you don't see any kind of binding whatsoever yet. You have a beautiful finished edge, and then the front of your quilt is clean and square. And I'm going to put a pin in this corner to hold it so I can turn it over to the front. So then the front of your quilt ends up being a beautiful, perfect square with no binding edge whatsoever. So because this is such a nice printed border, I really didn't want to take away from it by adding a binding, and that's why I chose to face it.